In the golden age of Elizabethan England, Queen Elizabeth I was more than just a monarch. She was a living symbol of power, intellect, and carefully crafted mystique. Presented to her people as the Virgin Queen, she stood as the divine face of national pride and artistic brilliance. Her court sparkled with poetry, music, and diplomacy, and history remembers her triumph over the Spanish Armada and her firm grip on a rising Protestant empire. But beneath the surface of velvet gowns and jewel-encrusted portraits lay a woman consumed not just by duty, but by fear. Fear of aging, fear of appearing weak, fear of losing control over how the world saw her, and that fear extended even to the way she cared for her body. Here's where it gets interesting. At a time when soap was scarce and bathing was a superstition-riddled ritual, Elizabeth's personal hygiene habits weren't just unusual. They were a deliberate performance. Cleanliness wasn't about science, it was about symbolism, and Elizabeth wielded it like a weapon. Let's begin with one of the most ironic aspects of her reign, her sweet tooth. In the 16th century, sugar was more valuable than gold, locked in chests, weighed like diamonds. But Elizabeth loved it. She devoured candied violets, sugar-glazed marzipan, and fruits preserved in syrup. For her, consuming sugar was a way to display England's wealth and her own power. But the cost of sweetness was steep. Dental care at the time was primitive and, tragically, misguided. The Queen reportedly cleaned her teeth with a sugary paste made from herbs, an act that, rather than protecting her smile, hastened its destruction. Abrasive powders wore down her enamel, while the sugar welcomed rot. By the 1590s, foreign ambassadors described her teeth as black and falling out. Her breath, according to herbalist John Gerard, was foul enough to disturb those in close conversation. Still, she refused to have them pulled. Even after a courtier had a tooth removed in front of her to prove it wasn't fatal, Elizabeth remained defiant. Pain was weakness, and weakness had no place on the throne. And yet, here's the twist. In a strange show of loyalty, noble women began darkening their own teeth to mirror the Queen's decaying smile. They used soot and charcoal not to appear beautiful, but to appear powerful, just like her. In Tudor England, even rot could be a fashion statement if it meant aligning with the crown. And what about bathing? There's a famous quote often linked to Elizabeth: "I bathe once a month, whether I need it or not." While historians still debate its accuracy, it reflects the mindset of her time. Water wasn't seen as cleansing. It was feared. It was believed to open the body to disease, disturb internal balance, and expose people to bad air, thought to carry illness. Instead, Elizabeth followed a different routine. She changed her linen undergarments several times a day, believing that the soft cloth absorbed impurities and cleansed the skin by touch alone. To the people of her era, this wasn't neglect. It was admirable discipline. Queen Elizabeth I didn't rely on soap and water to stay clean. Instead, she turned to rose water, vinegar rinses, and fragrant herbal infusions, concoctions specially crafted by her royal apothecaries. These were applied with care by her ladies-in-waiting, not only to refresh the skin, but to symbolically guard it. In the absence of plumbing, this ritual was considered far safer and more refined than a full bath. But bathing, when it did happen, was no simple task. Imagine the scene. Wooden tubs hauled into her private chambers, buckets of hot water carried one by one, and a trio of attendants orchestrating every step. The process was so elaborate, so theatrical that it was almost treated like a sacred ceremony. Full immersion in water became a rare event, reserved for only the most special occasions. And yet, by the standards of the 16th century, Elizabeth was considered impeccably clean. But here's the catch. Her cleanliness was an illusion, a visual armor carefully maintained through perfume, wardrobe, and reputation. She owned hundreds of gowns, draped herself in sweet-smelling gloves and silken undergarments, and ensured that every fold of fabric and lock of hair was curated to perfection. She didn't reject water because she was careless. She avoided it because it posed a threat to the carefully maintained myth of her divinity. Nowhere was this illusion more powerful or more dangerous than on her face. Elizabeth's pale, luminous skin has become iconic, but that ghostly complexion wasn't natural. It was painted on, layer by layer, day after day. Her makeup of choice was a substance called Venetian ceruse, a thick white paste made from vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead. And as it brightened her skin, it slowly poisoned her from within. What began as a symbol of nobility turned into a slow form of self-destruction. Over time, the lead corroded her skin, leaving behind sores, scars, and open lesions. But instead of removing the makeup, she simply applied it thicker. Add to that her crimson lip color, crafted from mercury-laced cinnabar, and you have a deadly cocktail absorbed directly into her bloodstream. Her health declined. Her mood became erratic, and yet she persisted. Why? Because her skin no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the crown. Her painted face wasn't just a look. It was her throne, a weapon, a lie she was determined to uphold, even as her body paid the price. She refused to be painted in natural light, and even portrait artists were forbidden from showing her true features. They were instructed to copy an earlier idealized version of her face, ensuring that every image, no matter how recent, still showed the queen in her youthful prime. Toward the end of her life, her makeup became a mask so fragile it was said to crumble if touched. She rarely washed her face, not out of negligence, but out of necessity. To remove the makeup would be to strip away the legend of Gloriana, the eternal virgin queen. But the fantasy stopped at the palace walls. Behind the velvet drapes and marble columns of her royal residences, a very different reality festered. There was no plumbing, no toilets, no sewage systems, not even a trickle of running water. Her palaces, like Hampton Court in Richmond, operated on systems that hadn't changed since medieval times. Even the Queen's own toilet, or close stool, was essentially a cushioned wooden chair with a chamber pot underneath. That pot had to be emptied multiple times a day, but not by nameless servants. It was the job of one of the most powerful and trusted men in court, the groom of the stool. Despite the name, this was not a lowly title. The groom of the stool was often a nobleman, hand-picked for his discretion and loyalty. He helped the queen dress, oversaw her hygiene, and was present for deeply personal and sometimes political moments. The position held immense influence and was a coveted path to the queen's ear. But beyond the royal chamber, hygiene in the palace took a darker turn. Waste from the rest of the household was gathered in chamber pots and dumped into cesspits. These pits, often located just outside the palace walls or sometimes beneath them, overflowed regularly. The work of removing this waste fell to night soil men or gong farmers who trudged through tight corridors with heavy pails of human refuse, working in darkness and stench to prevent the palace from drowning in its own filth. It was a world of contradictions, grandeur built upon rot, beauty propped up by decay. The scent of Queen Elizabeth's court was not always as sweet as the power it represented. In fact, behind the silks and ceremony, foul odors lingered, relentless and ever-present. To combat them, courtiers scattered lavender, rosemary, and sweet marjoram across the palace floors. Incense smoldered in corners. The rushes covering the wooden floorboards were soaked in fragrant oils. But here's the dirty truth. Those rushes were rarely replaced. Beneath them, filth accumulated, layers of hair, food scraps, spilled wine, and human waste hidden beneath a facade of perfume. It was elegance built on rot. Even the Queen's movements were strategic. She didn't just travel from palace to palace for diplomacy. She moved to outrun the stench. With no plumbing, the longer the court remained in one place, the worse the conditions became. Elizabeth's court, for all its splendor, lived in a strange contradiction, where velvet-lined chambers housed chamber pots, and where the most powerful woman in England reigned beside the inescapable odor of decay. But if you truly want to understand her hygiene, you have to understand her obsession, not with cleanliness, but with control. Elizabeth's body was her battlefield, her powdered face, her gloved hands. None of it was vanity. It was discipline, armor. Every ritual she practiced, every fragrance she wore, was designed to keep the world at a distance. And nowhere was that more visible than in her rejection of bathing. In Tudor England, bathing wasn't just inconvenient, it was intimate. It required vulnerability. It exposed the skin, softened the body, and left a person open to judgment, disease, or worse. For a queen who had seen women destroyed by their weaknesses, including her own mother, Anne Boleyn, this was unacceptable. Instead, Elizabeth cloaked herself in scented protection. Each day she was enveloped in perfumed elixirs brewed in the palace still rooms. Lavender, rose, orris root, cloves, and rosemary were steeped in vinegar or alcohol. These potions weren't meant to cleanse. They were meant to conceal. A dab behind the ears, a sweep across the wrists. That was enough to maintain the illusion. And when the air turned foul, she simply lifted a pomander, a delicate orb-shaped container filled with herbs and resins, up to her nose. Worn at her waist or tucked inside her bodice, it was both a symbol and a shield. Where others relied on soap and water, Elizabeth breathed curated purity. Her strategy extended to every part of her wardrobe. Her gloves were perfumed, her handkerchiefs embroidered and soaked in aromatic oils. Even her dresses, layered, heavy, and impenetrable, helped trap her royal scent and suppress the truth underneath. She even gifted perfumed gloves to her favorites at court. But it was never a gift of intimacy. It was a gesture of dominance. You may share my fragrance, but never my body. Hair washing? Out of the question. Elizabeth's hair, when not hidden beneath towering wigs, was powdered and styled with sugar water or egg whites. As her natural hair thinned, either from age or lead poisoning, she adopted auburn wigs scented and sculpted to perfection. And though she aged like any woman, she allowed no signs of it to reach the public eye. But beneath the perfumes and powders, her body betrayed her. Her skin, ravaged by years of toxic cosmetics, became paper-thin. Open sores and flaking patches were whispered about behind closed doors. Still, she clung to her rituals. She didn't scale them back. She intensified them. In her later years, Elizabeth became increasingly private, even paranoid. She banned mirrors from her chambers. She forbade artists from painting her unless they adhered to strict rules: no wrinkles, no shadows, no signs of aging. Every portrait was a fantasy, one that must never falter. Some claimed she employed a maid for the sole task of reapplying powder to her shoulders in secret, ensuring no one ever saw the truth, because the mask could never slip, not even when she was alone. Bathing then wasn't just avoided, it was rejected. It represented reality, something Elizabeth could not afford. A bath would strip her of the armor, expose her decay, and dissolve the illusion she had spent a lifetime building. She didn't fear dirt. She feared being seen. To bathe would have been to admit the truth that Elizabeth Tudor was, in the end, simply human. But she had spent her reign building something far more powerful than a nation. She built a myth. In her final years, the Queen walked with a scented cane, an elegant staff she lifted gently to her face whenever the odor of a courtier became too much to bear. But it wasn't just about smell. It was theater, a silent performance, a gesture that reminded everyone of the space between them and her, between mere mortals and the crown. Her body was no longer just her own. It had become a symbol, a sacred extension of the monarchy itself. In Elizabeth's world, cleanliness had nothing to do with soap or even health. It was all about image, and image was everything. And that, perhaps, is her most astonishing legacy. Queen Elizabeth I is remembered not because she was spotless, but because she understood, better than anyone, the true power of illusion. Her strange hygiene rituals weren't careless or ignorant. They were calculated, controlled, rooted in a society that linked purity to performance, stillness to strength, and ritual to rule. To wash too often was to risk wiping away the mask. And Elizabeth, she never let it slip. So instead, she powdered. She perfumed. She perfected every detail of her presence, and in doing so, she ascended beyond the limitations of the flesh. Unwashed? Yes, but unforgettable. In the grand court of Elizabeth I, cleanliness was never about comfort. It was about survival.